Let's take a look at the next super chat. Neophyte1, thank you for another super chat. I could pick your brain all day, but this will be my last question. In Job, Satan is portrayed as a son of God. How does he relate to the second God?
Oh, that's a lovely one. Yes, well, Job, the book of Job is full of problems, but in the prose framework of the book of Job, all the great angels are up in heaven and they're having a chat, and generally being angels up in heaven. And Satan comes to Yahweh and says, your servant Job is only loyal to you because of what he can get out of it. You go and tempt him and see if he will still remain faithful. And this is a very interesting glimpse of the world of the Hebrew temple when Satan is there, and he is amongst the angels still, but he's as a tempter, and he is challenging Yahweh to test his servants. So Satan is and remains an angel, a son of God, but he's a fallen son of God, and that's very important. And in the book of Job, he taunts Yahweh and says, your servants are only loyal to you because it's in their interests to do that. So that's how he relates to him.
What do you think caused the first Christians, the earliest Christians, to decide to stick with the older Israelite practices that there were two heavenly powers instead of sticking to the later edited reformed practice of only one God?
I suspect because the older ways have never gone away, and that, you see, it was the old question of the power of the publishing houses. Until recently, we only had the writings of, or any studied seriously, the writings of the Second Temple Jews, correctly so called. But now we are realizing that so many other texts are witnesses to a huge variety of heirs of Hebrew tradition and culture. And the Jesus of Nazareth actually was the catalyst who brought them all together. And this is why there's so many varieties in early Christianity, 7 sects of this and that, so forth, that you get listed, because they existed in their many different forms already, and Christianity became a kind of unifying factor for them. But they kept with them a lot of the older differences, customs, what have you, that they brought from their pre-Jesus era. You see this illustrated very interestingly in the book of Revelation, where Revelation chapter 7, where you have the angel of the dawn who comes with his seal, and he's going to mark the servants of God on their foreheads. And first of all, he marks 12,000 from each of the old tribes. So this is a Hebrew vision. And then there's a kind of supplement that says, and then there's a crowd of people from every people and nation and tongue and so forth. And that's the new influx of Gentiles that came into the movement with the missionary work of the first Christians. But they really found a way of coming together and finding a voice and a unity and a presence because of the ministry of Jesus.
Christopher Malloy, thank you for your super chat. Was the trial of Jesus Christ and Jesus Barabbas a literal or metaphorical retelling of the Passover sacrifice ritual?
That's a very interesting question. It's not the Passover sacrifice, though. It's the Day of Atonement sacrifice. This is one of the biggest problems in Christian exegesis, understanding Holy Week in the context of the temple. You find this, you know the story of the Day of Atonement. You have to have two identical goats, and one is killed and one is driven off, and so forth. And you find this in the earliest Christian commentators. You find it in the book of Hebrews. You find it in the letter of Barnabas, which used to be in the New Testament and then got dropped. The date of the crucifixion was Passover, but we're not sure whether it was the day of Passover or whether it was the day after Passover, was the Last Supper a Passover meal, all this kind of thing. But the earliest Christian theology, the dominant strain, sees the crucifixion as the Day of Atonement sacrifice. You see, Passover at that time had nothing to do with atonement. And the great high priestly ritual that involved symbolically the high priest's sacrifice of himself, but for practical reasons you offered a goat instead. This was fulfilled. You see this in Hebrews 9. Hebrews 9 talks about the great redemption, the great atonement sacrifice, not being made with substitutes of bulls, calves and goats, but with Jesus himself. So that's another area that needs a lot of unpacking if you do your temple theology properly. Jesus and Barabbas is one of the many motifs of not the Passover sacrifice, but the Day of Atonement sacrifice. And when you start looking at it in that context, a lot of the questions disappear. Others arise, but yeah, it's a very exciting thing to do.
In page 100 to 101 in your book, you talk about the fusion between El and Yahweh by the editors of the Old Testament. But in the next page, you get into Simon Bar Kokhba. Now, Bar Kokhba means son of the star.
Yeah.
What do you think is happening there? Why are they calling this Simon guy in the 2nd century CE? Major.
He's another messianic figure. He wants to rebuild the temple. He's if you like, a Jesus character. This was a much broader movement than just the Christians. If you look at the Bar Kokhba coin that was minted in, I can't remember the date, 135 perhaps. And if you look on it, it shows you 4 pillars of a temple building and then an arc between the 2 central pillars. Now, 4 pillars on a building represents the Holy of Holies, 5 pillars represents the temple. So this isn't just the rebuilding of the temple. This is looking again into the Holy of Holies, and the ark is restored. And that is exactly the vision you have at the end of Revelation chapter 11. God's temple in heaven was opened and the ark was seen. The ark disappeared. It wasn't in the second temple. This restoration of the ark was going to be the sign of the true temple returning. It's the central vision in the book of Revelation, and it's also the image that was chosen for the Bar Kokhba coin. So they were all hoping for the same thing. And it's only the way history has been written that has obscured what was really going on.
We got another super chat. Neophyte 1 looks like he's back for another question. Many early Gnostic Christians believed the God of Moses was different from the Father of Jesus. Could this have been an esoteric teaching of Jesus?
Now this gets us into very complicated territory indeed. The Gnostics, by and large, and here I've got to be broad brush, and there will be many people who could say, but, and that's quite true. The Gnostics, by and large, were perpetuating, sometimes in garbled form, the heavenly world of the first temple. So all those hierarchies of angels and things like that, if you know the first temple quite well, you recognize them, albeit in a slightly garbled form. And the great enemy of the first temple people was the hierarchy that developed in the second temple at the time when the emphasis on Moses was increasing. During the time of the monarchy, Moses was there, but he wasn't a big, important figure. After the decline of the monarchy, Second Temple period, Moses becomes more and more and more important because they don't have kings. Although Philo actually compared Moses to a king, which is quite interesting, shows how far the fusion had gone. Now, because the first temple was the one where the Gnostics had their roots, everything that was in the second temple, namely the God that was, the one God that's associated with the rising power of Moses, becomes for them a bad thing. And he is known as the God of the blind, or the blind God. And this is because in the first book of Enoch, there is a fragment. This is the best example I can give you. There's a fragment of a history of Jerusalem. It's called the Apocalypse of Weeks. And it says that when the people began to turn away from the first temple religion, the priests became blind. They lost their spiritual sight, literally is what it says. And so all the people who followed the new, improved, really Moses alone version of Hebrew faith that developed, they became called the people who had lost their spiritual sight. And the one God of the second temple becomes known as the God of the blind. And that's what lies behind a lot of the hostility in the Gnostic texts.
Why do you think that the Gnostics viewed the Jewish God as evil?
Because he represented everything in the second temple that they regarded as evil. And so, just as they wanted the harlot temple to be burned, so they wanted the restoration of the original deities, I have to use the plural, of the original Temple of Solomon. But you can unpack this. I mean, it takes a lot of doing in the Gnostic text, and a lot of the Gnostic texts we only have in Coptic and very garbled, and some have come through Greek. Some seem to have come directly from a Semitic language, I think Hebrew. And a lot of the technical terms in the Gnostic texts are clearly someone who didn't understand the Hebrew he or she was hearing. And so we've got lots of very interesting spelling mistakes. But once you know, again, the hazards that you're looking for, you can, particularly in the early Gnostic texts, you can reconstruct quite a lot of the first temple from them. But it was hostility to the second temple, which meant hostility to the way God was viewed in the second temple.
They also thought that Satan was the Jewish God. Why do you think they were thinking that? Why do you think they took it that far, that the outright think that he's the
I
devil?
don't know. I don't know the answer to that at all. There was certainly huge hostility. But the problem is, whenever you're dealing with these things, for example, the Gnostics that I've just mentioned very briefly, until 1947, was it 47 or 45, when the Nag Hammadi find was made, we had to rely mainly, there were other texts, but mainly we only knew about the Gnostics from people who didn't like them, like Epiphanius of Salamis, like Irenaeus. I mean, he wrote, his great life's work was rubbishing the Gnostics, and you don't expect to get a fair and reasoned account of a religious group from people who absolutely hate them. And so we've got embedded in our perception of the Gnostics how their enemies described them. And that's really wrong foots you from the start. So getting back to what they actually thought is another task for biblical scholars. I mean, there's plenty of work to do.
Last question. In page 105, you talk about the Philo and the Targums
Oh, yes.
show that the word was much a designation of Yahweh as a name.
Yeah.
Could you discuss with the audience what's going on there?
Well, the name of the Lord was deemed to be too sacred to pronounce, and indeed still is. And so when you are reading a Hebrew text and you come across the name, the 4 letters of the name, you automatically read another word. You either read Adonai, which means Lord, or you read Hashem, which means the name, and there may be other things as well. And the name comes to be, if you like, a reverent way of avoiding using the actual sacred name. And as a result of this, we're not quite sure how it was pronounced, and where you can rely on, we have to rely on, Greeks who said, well, it sounded like this, but then Greek doesn't sound like Hebrew. It's got different noises completely, different shaped mouth when you're speaking it. So just to use the name as, capital N avoids the problem, really.
We have a super chat question. Paul Kickling, thank you for your super chat. If Christ and Antichrist are the same unity, let me reread that, are from the same unity, from the monad being crucified to create dualism, why is it so hard for people to understand brothers also basically means they are the same person?
I would need to think about that question a lot. It's a very interesting question, but honestly, I don't think I would want to start answering it without giving it a lot of thought. So I'm sorry about that, but it is a very interesting question.